What if doing the right thing in one country made you a criminal in another? That's not hypothetical. It happens in global business every single day. Welcome back. Today we're diving into one of the most fascinating and honestly underappreciated topics in business ethics: how culture and time shape what we consider ethical behavior in the first place. By the end of this video, you'll understand why ethical standards aren't universal, how history bends moral expectations, why the same action can be heroic in one boardroom and scandalous in another, what relativism means for global companies, and how businesses can actually navigate this complexity without losing their integrity. Let's get into it. Section 1. Ethics is not one size fits all. Here's something that might shake your foundation a little. Most of us grow up believing that right and wrong are obvious. Don't lie. Don't steal. Treat people fairly. But when you zoom out and look at business practices across different cultures, you start to see that obvious is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Take gift giving. In the United States, offering a government official a gift before a business deal can land you in federal court under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. That's bribery. Full stop. But in parts of East Asia and the Middle East, gift giving is a deeply embedded cultural ritual. It signals respect, builds relationships, and is expected before serious negotiations even begin. The action is identical, the meaning is completely different. This is the core challenge of cross-cultural business ethics. Ethics doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists inside communities, traditions, religions, and social structures that vary enormously from place to place. What one culture calls a bribe, another calls courtesy. What one society calls aggressive negotiation, another calls dishonesty. So here's the question that should be keeping business leaders up at night. If ethics varies by culture, does that mean anything goes? We'll come back to that. But first, let's look at where these cultural differences actually come from. Section 2. The roots of cultural ethics. Cultural ethical norms don't appear out of nowhere. They're the product of centuries, sometimes millennia, of religion, philosophy, law, and lived experience layered on top of each other. Consider how differently Western and Eastern philosophical traditions approach the individual versus the group. Much of Western business ethics is rooted in individual rights: your right to fair treatment, your right to honest information, your autonomy as a consumer or worker. This traces back through Enlightenment philosophy, through John Locke, through the entire framework of liberal democracy. But in many East Asian cultures, particularly those influenced by Confucian thought, ethics is more collectivist. The group, the family, the company, the society takes priority over the individual. Loyalty, harmony, and hierarchy aren't just cultural preferences, they're moral values. That means whistleblowing, which looks heroic through a Western lens, can look like betrayal and disgrace through a Confucian one. Religion plays an equally powerful role. Islamic finance prohibits charging interest on loans, something Western banks do as a matter of daily routine. In societies shaped by Protestant Christianity, hard work and profit are seen as signs of virtue. In others, excessive accumulation of wealth is a moral failure. None of these frameworks are wrong. They're all internally consistent. They're all trying to answer the same fundamental question: how should people treat each other? They just arrive at different answers based on different starting points. And that should make you wonder, what happens when these systems collide in the global marketplace? That's exactly where things get complicated. Section 3. Cultural relativism versus universal ethics. Here's where the real debate lives. Cultural relativism is the idea that ethical standards are determined by culture, and no culture standards are objectively superior to another's. On the surface, that sounds respectful and open-minded, but push it to its logical conclusion, and you run into serious problems. If relativism is completely true, then a multinational company operating in a country that tolerates child labor, forced labor, or extreme environmental destruction would have no ethical grounds to push back. That's just their culture, becomes a get-out-of-jail-free card for exploitation. That's why many ethicists argue for a middle ground, what you might call moral pluralism with a floor. The idea is that while many ethical differences between cultures deserve genuine respect, there are some baseline human rights that no cultural tradition can override. Things like the prohibition against slavery, the protection of children, the right to basic dignity. These aren't Western impositions. They're increasingly recognized in international law, in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and in the evolving consensus of global civil society. The practical upshot for businesses is this: be humble about cultural differences, adapt where you can, but don't use cultural sensitivity as an excuse to tolerate serious harm. There's a difference between respecting local customs and abandoning your core values. The question is, where exactly is that line? And that brings us to how ethics changes not just across space, but across time. Section 4. How time changes ethical standards. Think about business practices from just 100 years ago that were completely legal and widely accepted. Child labor in factories, segregated workplaces, companies dumping waste directly into rivers. These weren't fringe behaviors. They were standard operating procedure. And most business people at the time didn't think of themselves as villains. They were operating within the ethical norms of their era. This is called temporal relativism, the idea that ethical standards evolve over time within a society. And it has massive implications for how we judge the past and how we prepare for the future. Consider how attitudes toward environmental responsibility have shifted. In the 1950s, a factory that released pollution into a river was barely newsworthy. Today, the same action triggers international headlines, regulatory investigations, and devastating consumer boycotts. The law changed. But more importantly, the moral consensus changed. Society decided that the environment matters, that future generations have a stake in today's decisions, and that profit doesn't justify destruction. The same evolution is happening right now around data privacy, artificial intelligence, diversity and inclusion, and executive pay. What's acceptable today may look indefensible to the next generation. And companies that get ahead of these shifts, that anticipate where moral consensus is heading, tend to come out stronger. Those that dig in and defend yesterday's norms often find themselves on the wrong side of history. So how does a company stay ethically current without being whipped around by every new trend? That's the million-dollar question we land on next. Section 5. Building an ethical framework that travels across cultures and time. The answer isn't to adopt moral relativism and abandon all standards. And it isn't to impose one culture's values on every market. The answer is to build an ethical framework grounded in enduring principles, things like transparency, fairness, human dignity, and accountability, while allowing genuine flexibility in how those principles are expressed locally. Global companies that do this well typically start by defining their non-negotiables. These are the lines that don't move regardless of market. No forced labor, no deception, no serious environmental harm. Everything else becomes a conversation with local culture, local law, and local stakeholders. They also invest in ethical leadership that's culturally competent. Leaders who understand that silence in one culture means disagreement, while in another, it means respect. Who know that directness is a virtue in some contexts and an insult in others. Who can hold firm values loosely enough to communicate them across difference. And they build feedback loops, ways for employees, customers, and communities in every market to raise concerns without fear of retaliation, because moral blind spots are most dangerous when no one feels safe pointing them out. So here's your takeaway. Ethics isn't a fixed destination. It's a moving, culturally embedded, historically shaped target. The best businesses don't pretend otherwise. They build systems flexible enough to adapt and principled enough to hold firm when it matters most. If this video made you think differently about global business or ethics in general, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about these ideas. Subscribe if you want more content that connects real-world business to the big questions that actually matter. And drop a comment below. I want to know, is there a business practice from another culture you find ethically confusing? Let's talk about it. See you in the next one.